For 3 decades, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. His smile could launch careers, his laughter could validate legends, and his silence could end reputations. But what most viewers never knew was that behind that famous desk, Carson kept a mental ledger of guests who crossed invisible lines, who revealed themselves not as stars, but as something far darker. This isn't a story about comedy or entertainment. This is about the moment when the mask slips, when fame cannot hide character, and when one of the most powerful men in television quietly decided that certain people would never again sit in that famous chair. Tonight, we're opening that forbidden chapter to reveal the guests who disgusted Johnny Carson so deeply that he banned them from his kingdom forever. Oliver Reed arrived at NBC on September 26, 1975, already 3 sheets to the wind. The British actor, known for his roles in classical films, stumbled onto the set reeking of alcohol, his eyes unfocused, his movements uncoordinated. Carson immediately sensed disaster. Reed collapsed into the guest chair, feet up, slurring his words, treating the entire production like his personal tavern. But the real horror began when he turned his attention to fellow guest Shelley Winters. The Oscar-winning actress attempted to join the conversation, and Reed unleashed a torrent of misogynistic venom. He told her women lacked intelligence, belonged in kitchens, and should keep their mouths shut. The studio froze. Carson's famous smile vanished. This wasn't television anymore. This was a public degradation. Winters, trembling with rage, grabbed her water glass and threw its contents directly into Reed's face. The audience erupted in applause. Carson sat there watching Reed drip with humiliation, and he didn't hand him a towel. He let the moment breathe, let America see what happened when arrogance met consequences. After the taping, Carson told his producer one sentence that sealed Reed's fate forever. Never let that man near me again, unless he's sober, or I'm dead. Reed's name was permanently erased from the guest list, not for being drunk, but for revealing the contempt he held for women. What made Reed's behavior particularly egregious to Carson was the violation of an unspoken code that governed The Tonight Show. Carson himself enjoyed drinking, attended legendary Hollywood parties, and was no stranger to the excesses of fame. But he maintained an absolute distinction between private indulgence and professional responsibility. When the cameras rolled, Carson was always in control, always sharp, always respecting the audience who invited him into their homes each night. Reed's drunkenness wasn't just unprofessional. It was a fundamental disrespect to everyone involved in the production. The crew who worked long hours to make the show flawless. The audience who took time from their lives to attend the taping. The viewers across America who trusted Carson to deliver quality entertainment. All of them were insulted by Reed's slovenly appearance and abusive behavior. Carson understood that his show represented a covenant with the American public, a promise that what they saw would be worth their attention. Reed shattered that covenant the moment he stumbled through the curtain, and his subsequent attack on Winters transformed a professional failure into a moral one. Bob Crane seemed perfect for television. As Colonel Hogan in the hit series, he embodied the charming American hero, funny and wholesome and safe. But Carson possessed an instinct that transcended performance. He could sense darkness beneath charm, and something about Crane made his skin crawl. During commercial breaks, Crane would approach Carson with a briefcase full of pornographic photographs he'd taken of women, some consensual participants, others unknowing victims of his hidden cameras. He'd whisper to Carson about his conquests, offering to arrange similar encounters, treating the Tonight Show host like a fellow pervert rather than a professional broadcaster. Carson was disgusted. This wasn't male bonding. This was a pathological sickness being paraded as normalcy. Crane couldn't read the contempt in Carson's eyes, because he was too consumed by his own obsessions. He believed every man shared his depravity. On June 29, 1978, Crane was found bludgeoned to death in an Arizona apartment, surrounded by videotapes documenting his secret life. When Carson heard the news, he wasn't surprised by the revelation of Crane's hidden activities. He'd seen that emptiness years earlier, recognized the hollowness behind the smile, understood that a man who reduces human beings to objects eventually becomes a target himself. Carson rarely mentioned Crane again, not from indifference, but from a sad validation that his instincts had been tragically correct all along. The Crane situation revealed something essential about Carson's character that separated him from many of his contemporaries in Hollywood. Despite his own complicated personal life, multiple marriages, and well-documented extramarital affairs, Carson maintained clear boundaries about what constituted acceptable behavior. His private failings never translated into public degradation of others. He never used his platform to objectify women, never treated his show as a hunting ground, never confused professional relationships with sexual opportunities. Crane's behavior represented everything Carson found repulsive about the dark underbelly of celebrity culture. The fact that Crane assumed Carson would be interested in his pornographic collection, that he believed successful men naturally bonded over sexual exploitation, revealed a profound misunderstanding of basic human decency. Carson's rejection of Crane wasn't prudishness or moral superiority. It was a simple recognition that some lines should never be crossed, and that fame doesn't grant permission to treat other human beings as collectible objects for personal gratification. Chevy Chase represented a new generation of comedy, brash and irreverent and unapologetically confident. His signature line on Saturday Night Live said everything about his worldview: "I'm Chevy Chase and you're not." At first, Carson saw potential in this young talent, perhaps even a successor to his throne. But that hope evaporated the moment Chase walked into the NBC studio. He treated the production crew like servants, yelling at makeup artists, mocking assistants, using classist insults with casual cruelty. For Carson, who considered his crew family and treated the cable puller with the same respect as the president, this behavior was unforgivable. During the actual interview, Chase didn't engage in conversation, he competed. He interrupted Carson constantly, not from enthusiasm, but from a need to prove intellectual superiority. He sat with his feet up, leaning back with visible disdain, as if appearing on The Tonight Show was doing Carson a favor rather than receiving one. Carson noticed everything: the cold eyes, the manufactured superiority, the mean-spirited humor that targeted people's physical appearances or career struggles. While contemporaries like Steve Martin and Robin Williams became Carson's close friends and received countless invitations back to the show, Chase's appearances grew increasingly rare before stopping entirely. Carson never issued a formal ban. He simply stopped calling. He'd rather feature an unknown animal trainer than endure Chase's condescension. Years later, when Chase's career imploded due to his toxic personality, when he was fired from Community and boycotted by former colleagues, people recognized how accurate Carson's judgment had been decades earlier. Carson saw the collapse coming when Chase was still ascending. Chase's downfall illustrated a principle Carson understood deeply: talent without humility is a house built on sand. Hollywood history is littered with gifted performers who destroyed their own careers through arrogance and cruelty. Chase possessed genuine comedic ability, sharp timing, and natural screen presence. Under different circumstances, with a better character, he could have enjoyed a career spanning decades at the highest levels of entertainment. Instead, his need to dominate every interaction, to prove himself superior to everyone around him, created a toxic reputation that eventually made him unemployable. Carson watched this pattern develop in real time during those early Tonight Show appearances. He saw how Chase treated people he perceived as beneath him, how he couldn't simply enjoy success, but had to weaponize it against others. The most telling aspect of Chase's personality was his inability to recognize that his behavior was self-destructive. Even as doors closed, as former friends distanced themselves, as opportunities dried up, Chase continued blaming others rather than examining his own conduct. Carson had no patience for this kind of willful blindness, and his quiet exclusion of Chase from the Tonight Show guest list served as an early warning that the industry eventually heeded. Jerry Lewis presented a different kind of poison. America knew him as the lovable comedian, the telethon host, raising millions for disabled children, the goofy professor making families laugh. Carson knew him as something else entirely. Lewis publicly declared that women shouldn't do comedy, that their biological purpose was producing babies, that seeing a woman tell jokes felt fundamentally wrong. While Carson actively supported female comedians like Joan Rivers and Roseanne Barr, during the 70s and 80s feminist movement, Lewis brought patriarchal toxicity into the Tonight Show stage. He interrupted female guests, criticized their appearances, and treated them as inferior species. But his misogyny was just one facet of a larger bitterness. Lewis blamed audiences when his jokes failed, scolding them for lacking sophistication rather than examining his own material. He ruled his family like a tyrant, and eventually disinherited all 6 sons from his first marriage, leaving them nothing while lavishing his fortune on his second wife and adopted daughter. Carson watched this bitterness corrode Lewis over the years, transforming a comedy legend into a resentful old man lecturing anyone within earshot. The frequency of Lewis's appearances diminished steadily. Carson grew tired of managing the emotional temperature, of watching a giant self-destruct through hatred and authoritarianism. Lewis proved that making people laugh means nothing if your heart is filled with contempt. The tragedy of Jerry Lewis was that his talent was never in question. He revolutionized physical comedy, created memorable characters, and influenced generations of performers. But talent became a prison when it wasn't accompanied by personal growth. Lewis remained frozen in the attitudes of his youth, unable or unwilling to evolve as society changed around him. His statements about women weren't simply outdated. They were hostile and demeaning, revealing a deep-seated belief in male superiority that poisoned his relationships, both professional and personal. Carson, despite his own imperfections, recognized that progress required adaptation. He understood that comedy should punch up at power, rather than down at the vulnerable, that humor could challenge without degrading, that making people laugh carried a responsibility not to reinforce harmful prejudices. Lewis rejected all of this, clinging to a worldview that celebrated dominance and dismissed equality. His final years became a bitter testament to the isolation that results from refusing to grow, from insisting that the world is wrong rather than examining whether your own perspective might need adjustment. Robert Blake brought a different kind of menace to the Tonight Show chair. Playing Detective Barretta made him a television icon, but Carson saw past the performance to something genuinely dangerous underneath. Blake didn't act threatening, he was threatening. His childhood abuse had curdled into adult hostility that radiated from him like heat from asphalt. He sat across from Carson with dead eyes, no warmth, no humor, just simmering rage barely contained by social convention. Blake was obsessed with guns and violence, frequently making statements about taking care of people who crossed him. When Carson tried to lighten these comments with jokes, Blake wouldn't play along. He'd stare silently before explaining in a flat voice that the world was a zoo where you either eat or get eaten. The studio would fall silent, not from admiration, but from fear. Carson confided to his production team that interviewing Blake felt like walking on eggshells, that every word had to be carefully chosen because Blake was unstable and vindictive. In 2001, Blake's wife was shot dead outside an Italian restaurant. Blake was acquitted criminally but found responsible in civil court. When the news broke, those who worked on The Tonight Show weren't surprised. They remembered those empty eyes, those chilling jokes about death, the feeling of standing next to someone capable of murder. Carson had recognized that darkness decades earlier, sitting across from a man whose soul had died long before his career did. Blake represented the most disturbing category on Carson's mental blacklist because his pathology wasn't merely offensive or unprofessional. It was genuinely dangerous. The other guests on this list displayed character flaws that damaged their reputations and relationships, but Blake carried the potential for actual physical harm. Carson's discomfort around Blake wasn't about hurt feelings or violated etiquette. It was a primal recognition of threat. Over decades of interviewing thousands of people, Carson developed an almost supernatural ability to read personalities, to distinguish between the merely difficult and the truly dangerous. With Blake, every instinct screamed warning. The way he spoke about conflict resolution always involved violence. The way he viewed human relationships always assumed betrayal and retaliation. The way he carried himself suggested a man constantly on the edge of explosion, held back only by the thinnest veneer of civilized behavior. Carson's fear proved tragically prescient when Blake's wife was murdered under circumstances that pointed directly to his involvement. Even his acquittal couldn't erase the civil court's finding of responsibility or the overwhelming evidence that Blake had, at minimum, created the environment that led to her death. Mickey Rooney completed this gallery of disappointment. Once the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, Judy Garland's co-star, Ava Gardner's husband, he arrived at The Tonight Show in his twilight years, carrying not wisdom but bitterness compressed into a small frame. Even as a grandfather, Rooney maintained predatory behavior toward young actresses, patting thighs, invading personal space, making sexual comments disguised as compliments. Carson often had to physically redirect conversations to protect uncomfortable female guests from Rooney's leering attention. Beyond his lechery, Rooney lived in delusion, believing he was still the king of Hollywood rather than a relic trading on ancient glory. He interrupted Carson constantly to lecture about professional ethics, pointing his finger and explaining how modern entertainment had degraded. He hijacked interviews to complain about his 8 ex-wives, bad-mouthing them while portraying himself as a victim despite his documented temper and abuse. He yelled at backstage staff for minor mistakes, constantly reminding them who he used to be, rather than demonstrating who he was now. Carson felt embarrassed for him, watching a monument collapse in real time. After Rooney left, Carson would exhale sharply and make pointed jokes about the overwhelming energy, the subtext clear to anyone paying attention. Rooney represented the saddest possible decline, a prodigy transformed through character failure into a senile, bitter man looked upon not with admiration but with pity. Rooney's fall from grace carried particular poignancy because, unlike the others on this list, he had genuinely earned his legendary status through decades of exceptional work. His early performances were groundbreaking, his partnership with Garland created cinematic magic, and his contributions to entertainment were undeniable. But somewhere along the way, success became entitlement, confidence became arrogance, and the worship he received in his prime convinced him that normal rules didn't apply. His treatment of women, both the sexual harassment and the pattern of failed marriages marked by allegations of abuse, revealed a man who viewed relationships as transactions where his fame entitled him to dominance. His condescension toward everyone around him, from Carson to the lowliest crew member, demonstrated a profound insecurity masked by bluster. The constant invocation of his past achievements betrayed the reality that he had nothing current to offer, no growth, no evolution, no wisdom gained from experience. Carson could forgive many things, but he couldn't stomach watching a once great performer reduce himself to a caricature, demanding respect based solely on what he'd accomplished 40 years earlier while behaving in ways that forfeited any claim to dignity. These 6 names represent something more than bad behavior. They reveal the fundamental truth Carson understood instinctively: talent opens doors, but only character keeps them open. Each of these men achieved remarkable success, became household names, earned fortunes and fame. But when the cameras captured them without scripts, when they sat opposite someone who could see through performance to essence, they revealed themselves as something less than their publicity suggested. Oliver Reed's drunken misogyny, Bob Crane's pathological perversion, Chevy Chase's calculated cruelty, Jerry Lewis's bitter authoritarianism, Robert Blake's murderous rage, Mickey Rooney's lecherous delusion. All of it emerged in Carson's presence because he created an environment where pretense eventually failed. Carson never made grand pronouncements about these bands. He simply stopped inviting them back, using his power quietly but absolutely. The lesson remains valid decades after Carson's final broadcast. You can fool audiences with talent, charm them with charisma, dazzle them with success, but you cannot hide your true nature forever. Eventually, someone with perception will see through the mask, and when that person holds power, the consequences are permanent. Johnny Carson spent 30 years separating performers from people, and these 6 failed that test completely. Their names remain not as legends but as warnings about the price of character failure at the highest levels of fame.